Okay, so we're going to get started here now, and we'll just open up the conversation to anyone who would like to go first.
I don't mind starting.
Okay.
First, I want to say thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm excited that you all recognize the importance of having a 1619 event. So thank you so much for hosting, and thank you for allowing me to be here. How many of you know that Harriet is coming out on November 1st, right? So Harriet is coming out on November 1st. I have to say that I'm very excited to go see it, and I pre-purchased my tickets to see it. And when I was on social media 2 days ago, I saw that Tyrese and others are protesting against it. So one of the things that Tyrese says is, why another slave movie, not another slave movie? And as I looked down through the comments that everyone was commenting under his post, they were in agreement with him. We don't want another slave movie. We don't want to hear it. We don't want to see it. We're tired. And while I disagree with this, I think I'm excited to see Harriet on the big screen. I understand where that sentiment is coming from. So sometimes when we hear one story and we hear it one way and it's one-dimensional and we're not telling it in a variety of ways, we have a tendency to reject what that is. And so that's what we're seeing there. I want to talk about what's happening. So the question is, what should we teach when it comes to race in our schools? I want to first back up a little bit and talk about what we are teaching and what's happening in our public schools right now. In 2015, which was a few years ago, a ninth grader came home from school. He was in a ninth grade in high school in a Texas school, and he came home to his mom, and he was really upset about the content of what he was reading about in his history books. And he said that they talked about in 1619, workers came from Africa, and they came as migrant workers to help with the U.S. economy. There was no mention of slavery in this book. There was no mention of the Africans being enslaved, and he was furious, and it hit social media like wildfire. McGraw-Hill apologized for that textbook, and they pulled the textbook, and they began to reconsider how they were showing and depicting slavery in those books. In January of 2018, we had a teacher in New York school system who wanted her students to understand how the enslaved came over to America or to the United States. And she had them get onto the floor and lay close together, and she had them pretend that they were in a slave ship, and she took the black students, according to the students, and she put her foot in their back to make them understand what it felt like to be a slave. It was in 2018. 2019, this year, we had also in New York another incident where the teacher in the private school wanted to depict what slavery was like, so she had her students reenact a slave auction. So she had the black students stand in front of the classroom, and she had the white students bid on the black students. This is, again, 2019. In Wisconsin, we had an incident where a gym teacher had the students reenact different games, and the white students were reenacting games like kickball and dodgeball, and the black students were told that they needed to reenact slave games that slaves played. So when we think about this idea of what's happening and what needs to be taught in our school, we need to take a look at what we are teaching and how we're teaching it in our schools. And it's not just unique to white teachers. A year ago, we had an African-American teacher during an assembly program. She had her students perform, and they had masks that were black face masks. And she didn't understand the significance of what that did, and some of the grandparents and parents that were in the audience were devastated and upset. And again, a whole long history needed to be taught, because even though she was African American, she lacked that historical knowledge that she needed to know that that should not have been something that happened. So this is something that we need to think about when we take the time to think about what needs to happen in our schools, how we need to present this, and why it's important that we begin to have these conversations like we're having today. So when we talk about our pre-K-12 and we talk about our college students, we need to say, who is ready to teach race in our classrooms? What does that look like? And where are they getting the training? So in our teacher education programs, that's where we need to first start, and we need to make sure that we are not graduating teachers that have not been indoctrinated and do not understand how race works, that they haven't examined their own personal biases and stereotypes, that they don't understand what needs to be taught and how it needs to be taught. We have to take a look at, first, our curriculum. When we talk about having books that are talking about blacks were migrant workers, we need to make sure that we're examining the curriculum that we're using. We need to make sure that we are preparing teachers in a way that they could teach in that way. And we need to make sure that we're able to have those conversations surrounding race. Professional development needs to be something that is happening in all of our schools, our pre-K-12 institutions, and we need to shift the focus, and I'll stop, I won't go on too much longer. We need to shift the focus of just looking at slavery and Jim Crow and civil rights from a one-dimensional point of view. We need to also teach about the strengths that existed within those groups during those times. We look at things from oppression, we look at things from trauma, we look at things from the beatings and the one story that we're telling. But what about the people that were doing the planning? And what about the people during the civil rights movement? What about those stories? And we need to talk about how we're doing that. So we need to look at things from a non-deficit point of view, and we need to make sure that we are looking at strengths, and we need to look at and take a serious look at how slaves enabled us to have the economy that we have today. And when we look at it from that point, we're not going to have students that are traumatized, and oftentimes our black and brown students feel embarrassed or ashamed when it's comes to teaching a race. So we need to make them understand the proud history that goes along with it too. So that's just part of what we need to do when we think about how we need to teach race in this country.
Thank you. Would anyone like to add to that?
So I can add from that. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. So I also would like to thank this panel and for being able to contribute today. My name is Amber Pabone, and I'm faculty here in secondary education in the College of Education. And so what I wanted to focus on is really sort of discussing sort of the theoretical principles for why we should be teaching about race. So I hear sort of the how, and I wanted to sort of take a step back to sort of reflect on what these necessary lessons are, and for K through 12 and in the college atmosphere. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge, right, that even discussions like this, and I'm sitting in this audience and looking around, right, so people often, feel uncomfortable or overwhelmed and even ashamed when engaging in discussions about race and racism in the K through 12 setting or in higher education classrooms. So like one of the things that I often have to do in my own teaching is to sort of engage in this prefacing, right, and some of my students are here shaking their heads, so that I can get everyone in a space whereby folks can be comfortable with engaging in this discussion. So I think that should be said first. In terms of what students and teachers, I suggest need to do is to understand the depth and history that perpetuates racism in the American education system. So I'm thinking here about context and content. So there's a piece where members of dominant culture, right, have access to a set of privileges, and that's rooted in historical hierarchy in this country, right? if we're not discussing the fact that dominant groups have these patterns of privileges that are also seen in education, then we're doing our students a disservice. So racism and oppression, as I teach my own students, extend far beyond like individual acts, right? And people acknowledging, people needing to acknowledge that historical effects of oppression impact diverse populations. So going back to thinking particularly about education, in my EDU 100 course, I often discuss that, for example, the American public school system is assumed to be equitable, right, and free from dominant norms, and these practices also take place in higher education. It's a complete falsehood. And so as a result, as already been shared, the materials that are taught, the ways the material are being presented, and even the ways in which school systems operate, right? And so I'm thinking here about the school to prison pipeline as an example, do not reflect the best interests of students of color. And so I'm going to say a term right here and lay it on the table, but bell hooks would suggest, right, that public education in this country exemplifies a white supremacist heteropatriarchal norms. So bell hooks, lowercase b, lowercase h, right? So if teachers in K-12 and higher education are committed to this work of critical social justice, then it requires this recognition that race and racism matters. So this operationalizing of colorblind epistemologies is just not effective whatsoever. Because to say that you're colorblind or that you don't see color is to effectively erase, right, my existence and the existence of the students of color in your classroom. So one easy step that educators can engage in is to invite the unique voices and perspectives of diverse student populations into the classroom. And that could be in person, but that could also be through text. I think also just another simple step is to continue to engage in making personal connections with students that highlight the various backgrounds that can enhance educational experiences for all students, right? So this education is not just for teaching students of color, Black students, Latinx students about their histories and their place in their places in society, but is also educating white students. All of this work, though, is not original to me, right? So I want to just make clear that I'm drawing from critical race theory, and specifically Gloria Ladson-Billings' work, who's sort of laid out this notion that we have to deal with race in education, and that uncomfortableness is a necessary part of our work. So for those of us who are like new to thinking about CRT, I'll just say what CRT means, and I'll say what those tenets are, so we can sit with that, and then we can continue with the next person. So critical race theory, just for everyone's definition, analyzes the role of racism in perpetuating social disparities between dominant and marginalized groups. So the purpose of CRT is to unearth what is taken for granted when analyzing race and privilege, as well as the profound patterns of exclusion that exist in U.S. society. And that's from Geraldo, 2010. So here's the tenets, not the tenants that live in your house, but the tenets, okay? Y'all with me? Racism is a permanent component of American life, number one, right? Number two, challenges claims of neutrality, objectivity, colorblindness, and meritocracy. Need to be challenged, right? CRT challenges centralizes the experiential knowledge of people of color as appropriate, as legitimate, and as integral to understanding racial inequality in this country. We also seek to challenge ahistoricism and emphasize the historical and contemporary relevance of race and racism. So this notion that students are playing a slave game and that is a joke, right, is to ignore, right, the history of racism in this country and how problematic and traumatizing that is to enact in such games. And finally, CRT is committed to social justice to eliminate oppression of all people, right? So this theoretical principle that can undergird our practices as teachers, future teachers, or faculty members is not just for one particular group, right? This is for the uplift of everyone. So, and sort of thinking about how we can engage in liberation politics, right, across our classrooms.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Okay. I wanted to go back to what you were saying before, and when you were saying that Tyrese was, and other people were agreeing with him and talking about boycotting the Harriet movie, and that they were like, no more slave movies, no more 13 years a slave, 12 years a slave, no more Harriet, no more, and for a long time, I felt very strong with that, and I very identified with that belief and viewpoint, because there's so many more things about African American and Black history that are more than, and culture that are more than just slavery and the Civil War and things of that nature. There's so much more to our culture and our history than just slavery. But when we have a society where African American history is not taught, it's not a required subject, it's not something, and history itself is not something that's taken very seriously in the school system. It's not something that's tested because it's not viewed as something that's important for students to learn, who will then become future members of the greater American society, and they'll no longer just be school children, they'll be people existing in this world. When we aren't taught these things, when we don't talk about minstrel shows, and we don't talk about Jim Crow and stuff like that, it creates an ignorant society that don't understand that there are Black people in this country, and there are people that are discriminated against to this day. And then when we talk about African American history, we need to examine our language when we do talk about these types of things. We need to stop saying things like blacks. We need to start saying Black people, because when you say blacks and whites, you take away their humanity. When you say slaves instead of enslaved people, you talk about the action instead of the action that happened to these people, that these people were psychologically, physically, emotionally, and generationally abused for many, many, many years. And then when we go to teachers teaching in schools, white teachers need to understand that when they're teaching Black students, they don't come from the same background, culture, and things like that with the students they're teaching. They can sympathize with what their students may be going through. They can do their best to learn and educate themselves, but they can't empathize. They can't truly understand unless we are, like you said, educating our teachers, and they are given, sensitivity training, things of that nature. If we don't tell our teachers that you're not going to be dealing with students that are the same as you, you're going to be dealing with students that are very different from you, and they're not going to listen to you, they're not going to want to be educated by you if you don't express that you sympathize and that you understand. And I think it's grossly negligent that a teacher would have blackface masks and then put their foot in the backs of students. Like, I believe I understand the intent with having the students lay down on the ground and have them try to understand what it was like to be on a slave ship, but to have a slave auction in class and embarrass students like that is absolutely unacceptable. And it's unacceptable for McGraw-Hill to have a textbook that says that African slaves and enslaved people were migrant workers who came here to help the economy, when that is absolutely not true. There was the triangular slave and the transatlantic slave trade, where Europeans were taking African people and they were bringing them to the Caribbean and the Americas, and the lifespan for a slave in the Caribbean versus a slave in America was about 6 years, or a year actually, I believe. If my African American history teacher in high school probably wants to kill me right now, but I believe the lifespan was anywhere from a year to 6 years, because when they were growing sugarcane and not cotton, that was very labor-intensive work. It was very hot, and they were beaten senselessly, and they didn't care about the longevity of keeping slaves like we did in the Americas. They were just like, oh, if they die, we'll just go get more. And that needs to be taught. And as kind of my closing is that something that stuck with me is a history teacher in high school. She told me that history is a lesson in humanity, and unless we learn our lesson, we're doomed to repeat ourselves forever.
morning, everyone. My name is Ayana Allen Handy. I'm here from Drexel University, and I'm extremely excited to be here with all of you to have this very important conversation. I wanted to start with reflecting on my own experiences as a teacher. I was a first grade teacher and a counselor in Houston, Texas, and I was, to say the least, ill prepared to be a social justice educator. My view back then was preparing my students for standardized testing. I had a responsibility to make sure that they were academically prepared, but really lacked a focus on how to develop global social justice citizens within my students. Back in 2001, policy played a really important part in what was happening in classrooms. There was accountability measures that had never been seen before under No Child Left Behind. And so instead of us being able to focus on how do you develop critical citizens who can learn to interrogate the status quo and be able to tear down these systems of oppression, I was focused on how many students can pass the test so that I could potentially get performance pay, which was a stipend depending on how well my students did on a test. And so when you have educators in this environment that's so test-driven, a lot is missing in terms of this critical social analysis. And so when I reflected on the questions of what should students know in schools and about race, I wanted to really think about this critical historical social analysis that actually starts with what Michael Jackson said, the man in the mirror, being able to look at and critically reflect upon our own autobiographical stories, our own autobiographical thoughts. So to think about, how do I know what I know that I know about race, about other races, about my experiences? And so people have been debating for centuries about whether race is a biological construct, a social construct, and those conversations are important, but I'm more interested in how does race show up in our society, in our classrooms, and how do we deal with it? How does race show up in our everyday lives? We all are existing together in this socio-political context. How does it show up? I also started thinking about, in order to really teach race, I think that Dr. Norris really gave us a great foundation to think about what's happening now in schools. And we really have to think about how we intentionally are mapping critical consciousness, critical social analysis from every level. And it begins with policy implementation and policy development. Those people and folks who are making policies that impact students in schools are usually have no idea about education, have never served as a teacher, never served as a principal, have never been in a classroom context. We can look at the Secretary of Education, who has never had any experience in public education, to be able to effectively lead the charge on issues that we're talking about today. I think about the challenge at various levels of teacher education. So I am a faculty member in a school of education, and I would say about 80% of our faculty lack a critical stance that Dr. Pabon was talking about, lack this critical social analysis. So you have teacher educators preparing teachers who are ill-equipped within themselves to deal with their own subjectivity and positionality around these and very important issues. There's the level of governance. So teacher education and teacher preparation is governed by what's called CAPE, which is an accreditation body that says this school, you have a mark of approval for being a great teacher preparation program. But even within that governance lacks this critical social analysis, this critical historical social analysis of race and racism. And then to the level of our curriculum, what teachers are taught as pre-service teachers. And I look at our curriculum as a teacher preparation program in Philadelphia. We are in the heart of West Philadelphia. Every single one of our educators should be prepared to do the things that Dr. Pabon and Dr. Norris have shared with us. But that's not the case because our curriculum is very disconnected. They get maybe one urban education course. I was the person that developed that course in 2015. When I first came, it was on the books in terms of being part of our curriculum, but there had never been a syllabus developed, never been any content developed around urban education when we are in the heart of West Philadelphia. And the majority of our teachers and pre-candidates are doing field work, are doing their teaching service within these schools with a lack of urban education and critical perspectives. And so again, looking at our curriculum and our preparation are things that I reflected on about this panel.
Hi, can you all hear me? Yeah. I'm Judy Berg. I teach at Villanova University. I teach history classes, 19th century U.S. history classes, so I teach a lot of classes on the history of slavery. I also teach classes on the Civil War and the post-war era. I also, when I graduated from college, was a teacher in the public schools in Texas for several years before I went back to become a teacher in college. So some of those textbooks that, that were shocked hit our classrooms, those are all vetted and authorized by the state of Texas. So we can thank the state of Texas for things like calling enslaved people workers instead of what they really are. So thank you all for coming and for the invitation. Thank you to the organizers for including me in this important event. I'm really thrilled to be here and to learn from my fellow panelists. I also want to compliment the history professors here at Kutztown for what they have done to really produce really history-minded students. So congratulations. It's a thrill to hear you plug history classes, more history classes, take more of them. So I've been teaching now for many years. And again, I'm a history teacher, so I'm not, I teach in the history program. I haven't stayed up to date on teacher education and those things, so I'm thrilled to be here on a panel with people who are. And what has struck me about teaching my courses at Villanova is how the language and the words that we use to teach these classes have changed over the couple of decades that I've been teaching history of slavery and things like that in my university. And I find myself every time I teach these classes searching for the right words, and those change. And it's important for us to acknowledge the power of the words we use to teach these subjects. This week is particularly, it underscores the importance of words and seizing control of words, I think, in particular. We started off the week with the president talking about how good of a businessman he was as president and how there were other presidents who were also businessmen. And he referred to George Washington, of course, whose business, was a plantation, of enslaved people. But he sort of scrubbed the history clean by using kind of this universal language of businessmen. And then, of course, just a couple of days ago, the same president has said that he is a victim of a lynching. These are very loaded terms, and they have very specific historical experiences behind them. And keeping control of that language is very important for those of us who teach this stuff, and for those of us who live in this country to be critical of the use of these terms. And it strikes me that the more and more we know, and I'm going to talk about my own classes where I teach the history of American slavery, the more and more we know about the history of American slavery, and we still are learning many, many things about the history of slavery in this country, what it meant, how it was experienced, and how enslaved people resisted it, which is why I also bought my tickets in advance to go see the Tubman movie and bringing some of my students to it as well, because it's a story ultimately about resistance. Words seem to fail us, and we're always, again, thinking about what are the right words to use to talk about this subject. We know, for instance, now, more than ever in the last 20 years, because of the work of scholars of American slavery, how central slavery was to the growth of the American economy. It wasn't just a side game. It was really central to American capitalism. Slavery was. And we know that growth, that the growth of the American economy in the early 19th century, in the mid-19th century, all of its success really had very shocking human consequences. And we're no longer in our history classes talking about something that's separate from the history of the American economy and American capitalism. I'll give you just two examples from the period that I study and the period that I teach. From around 1820 to around 1860, about 1 million people were sold from places like Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina to places like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, right, in that short amount of time. Each of these people left behind family, and they were referred to in these bills of sale as prime field hands. At least 1/4 of those sold were 8 to 14 or 15 years old. These were children, and they were nearly always sold without any parent or other sibling. These numbers, by the way, are from a scholar of this period whose name is Walter Johnson, if you want to look at these numbers. The selling of children, then, is what we're talking about, right? But we use terms in our textbooks and often in our classes that don't capture the horrific nature of what we're talking about. We use the term domestic slave trade, right, to describe what I just gave you some numbers for. And what did these children do when they came to Louisiana or Mississippi or Texas? They picked cotton at a rapid pace. And indeed, right, when we look at the numbers, we might even say, people have thrown up their hands and said it's impossible, right, that people can work that hard. According to another historian of this period, Ed Baptist, in 1 year, in the year 1836, 1 million people, enslaved people, produced about $600 million in cotton, or nearly half of all economic activity in the US. And just let that sink in. About 1 million enslaved people, that was about 6% of the population, are producing about half of the economic activity in the United States in that 1 year. And the term we use to describe that is efficiency. We admire the American economy's efficiency in this period. We compliment businessmen who achieved it. We celebrate how the economy grew and with it, the infant nation. And efficiency is the term we use to describe it. When we look at the books, the records of these farms, these plantation records, historians have asked the question about whether or not we might use more accurate terms like torture. With my students, I spent a lot of time thinking about these terms and what they mean and the consequences of continuing to use these terms in our classes and the difference it can make, not only for our understanding history, but really sort of thinking about where that history is today and how it is referenced and accessed with us today and how it can help us rethink the situations and the world we live in today. And we talk about, and I'll just give you a few examples of the words that we talk about in my classes, and then we think about what are more appropriate and more useful words for us to use. And I hope that'll give us some other things to think about and talk about. I use the term domestic slave trade. That's the term we use for the selling of human beings from the sort of old South or upper South into the lower South, the cotton frontier. Where scholars today really are referring to this time period now more accurately, I think, as the Second Middle Passage. So think about what the terminology, what the shift in terminology means, from referring to a domestic slave trade, something that sounds sort of quaint and unassuming and not really significant, to the Second Middle Passage. We, in our classes, right, as you had just mentioned earlier, move away from using the term slaves, right? Instead, we refer to people as enslaved people. We don't identify them by their status in a slave society, but instead refer to them as people, right? And describe those people as enslaved people. And that has meaning. Right? It's not just sort of the use of words. Those words mean something. What about the term master? Is that a term that we're still using? Yes, it is very much a term we're still using, and it still shows up in our textbooks, and it shows up in the newspaper. Whereas scholars of this period, and in my classes, I push my students and urge my students to think about using more precise terms like the term enslaver. Mm-hmm. And how does that shift the way we think about these people and the choices they made at the time that they were living? Right? This is an action. This is active. What are they doing? They are enslaving. Right? And these terms mean something not only for the time period that I study and I teach about, but for what we think about today as sort of our lingering responsibility to eradicate slavery today, right? When we think about enslaving an enslaver, those are active, those are actions. A mistress, right? A mistress is also an enslaver. Let's use the language that describes the person accurately. We also talk in my classes about terms that we might want to avoid, right? Once we learn the history of this institution and what it meant for the people who survived it, we avoid those terms like master and mistress. They're really imprecise, and they don't really capture the experience of being on one side or the other of this equation. Slave breeding is a term that shows up a lot in textbooks still, but really what we're talking about is forced reproduction, and let's talk about it in those terms. And one of my favorites that I still have to sort of always unpack and think about and talk about with my students is the term interracial sex, when what we're talking about is rape. And it's important for us to use those terms when we talk about these experiences. And by the way, if you ever want to look at what a group of historians who talk about this stuff and teach about this stuff, they've come up with a handy little handout, and the historian who's put it together, her name is Gabrielle Foreman, and she's at Penn State University, so you can check it out. And you can see her longer list based on sort of talking to people in colleges who teach about slavery and how we might do a better job of it. She has a lot of these terms and other terms as well. Those are some of the thoughts that I had and wanted to add to our conversation today. Thank you.
So I wanted to thank you for what you both just shared. Really made me think about this notion of linguistic precision, right? In terms of how we're really being specific about the terms that we utilize and how the need to shift terminology relative to our deepening understandings. And so it inspired me to think about that in the context of teacher education and what that could look like. So you all both inspired me as well to think about like what that preparation can be more inclusive of in terms of like curricular components. And so one part, and I agree with you, that's sort of absent in our urban teacher preparation in particular, if a program even has an urban teacher preparation course. Our program has one, but I've been in other universities that do not have an urban teacher preparation program. And so therefore, those teachers are not going to do that work in K through 12 classrooms. So this reminded me of some earlier work that I'd engaged in about an alternative, like what my dream teacher preparation program might look like, and sort of the topics that are related to race. And I totally forgot about this, so thank you all. The topics related to race that would need to go in that program. So it would not actually just be limited to one course, right? So I'm thinking about literature, right? So the literature of African American folks, Latino or Chicano people, and also people of Asian descent. We're thinking about people of color. When we're thinking about racial oppression and discrimination, so absolutely yes, slavery, and then also Jim Crow, right? And then also like passive racism, and then also this notion of post-racialism, right? That we hear often in popular media. In terms of policy, let's think about how teachers are prepared in their own study to raise topics like post-Fordist economy and the impact that had on communities of color in this country. The crack epidemic, right? So we have an opiate epidemic, but when I was a kid, the crack epidemic was a thing, right? And significantly impacting the lives of racialized minorities. The war on poverty is another term that was used during the Reagan administration. that I think is important, that specifically focused on people of color alongside the document A Nation at Risk, No Child Left Behind, and A Race to the Top. So these are other policies that we see embedded implicitly in there, these particular attacks on marginalized populations, people of color, people of low socioeconomic status. So there's this implicit or null curriculum that is racially contextualized. And then finally, activism as another category, right? So this can also be disappeared in our history textbooks. So the civil rights movement, and we talked just the other day about being obviously more than just Rosa Parks. We talked the other day about Plessy versus Ferguson, right? The Black Power movement. We're here in Philadelphia. What do y'all know about push and move? Right? That's very much disappeared in the textbooks. The Chicano labor movement, Aspira, La Raza, and El Puente, just to name some of the activist movements that have taken place in major metropolitan cities in this country that have been a pushback against marginalized, historicized, focused oppression, because it is not just the case that folks have been enslaved and then it's 2019 and we're rappers. Like, no, that's not it, right? So my argument here is that exposure to the stories and the experiences and histories of marginalized folks are just one step in the process of developing among teachers the sensitivity and capacity to critically reflect on their own perceptions and potentially complicity. I'm just going to name that as well.
So can I say, one of the things that I think that we fail to do when we teach about race in the United States, we start at 1619. And so most other groups and most other race groups or ethnicities have a tendency to, if you go into the Jewish Holocaust Museum, you'll see their history before who they were before the Holocaust. What we miss and what we fail to do with our students is we start in oppression. And we start at a place where students have a tendency to feel humiliation and shame. And so we need to back it up before 1619. And we need to understand where we were, what we were doing, who we were. And I had an opportunity this past summer to travel to the motherland for the first time. And it was absolutely amazing, and it's something that more of us need to be able to do. Our students need to know who they were before 1619, and that's a piece that's really missing from our history books. The other piece that I want to talk about is the idea of policy, and I think you brought up the idea, if it's not written down and it's not in policy, 9 times out of 10 it's not going to happen. So if we don't have cultural competencies built into our programs, all of our programs, then we're going to either do them or not. If you happen to be lucky and you get a professor who's going to do them, then you're blessed. And if you don't, you don't, because it doesn't matter. So when something is important to us and when we value something and when something matters, we put it into the policy. So that's one of the first things that we need to begin to say, that this is important enough. We need to teach it. This is what it needs to look like, and it needs to be a part of our written curricula, and it needs to be throughout all of our schools, our institutions, and for all students, not just in urban areas. So those are the 2 things that I kind of wanted to make sure that we really remember. And the final thing that I wanted to say, and I brought it up earlier, but I wanted to bring it up again, when we talk about things about what we're teaching, we need to make sure that we remember the strength of a people, and that's something, and the resilience of a people, and that's something that there needs to be a connection with that I feel like a lot of times we lose. And if we use these literature books, sometimes teachers are really good at bringing the literature of a people into the classroom, but if we don't correctly unpack that literature or allow the students to understand what is behind that literature, sometimes that turns into something else. I can remember sitting in the classroom and we read stories, To Kill a Mockingbird and those kinds of things. And I remember instead of it being something that we were excited to learn about and a learning opportunity, it ended up being an embarrassment. I didn't want to go to class being one of only African Americans in the class and hear the language that was being in that book without having a background story, without the teacher being able to unpack it in a way that made it make sense to us, to me, and to my other classmates. So that's another piece that I think that we're missing in when we are teaching in our pre-K 12 and at our universities.
If I may, that is a very good point you put on. Last semester, I took a very interesting English class, and one of the books that we read in the class was The Hate U Give. If anyone's unfamiliar with it, it's about a young woman who's coming back from a party and her best childhood friend is shot and killed by the police, and the cop is acquitted for it. And then it talks about her journey through that process and things of that nature. And I was one of maybe 3 black students in that class, and it was a group discussion style class, so we put the desk in a circular formation, and every single time any discussion started, it was always, all the kids always turned to look at me, and they was like, well, how do you feel? What do you have to say about this? And it's like, I live this. Like, I may not have had a friend shot and killed in front of me. I'm every day thankful for something like that, but the reality is that that could happen. And it has happened, and it does happen every single day. Black students are not they're not your lens or your microscope into the black experience. We don't have to, and we don't want to share what it's like to live in our own skin every day with people that do not understand and will not understand, and that you're only asking just because, oh, you want to know, not because you genuinely care about a system that's been in place for a very long time. And when you're talking about the history of starting at slavery and not talking about who black people and who Africans were before, I think a good way to teach history would be start maybe at the present. Instead of starting at the past, start at the present and then work your way backwards and talk about the systems that are in place now, talk about the cultural and systemic and societal things that are in place now, and work your way backwards and talk about how they were historically made to happen. Talk about the school to prison pipeline and how it's another way to demonize and take away the innocence of black children. Statistically, black children, specifically black boys, are more likely to be suspended, put in detention, and expelled from schools than their white counterparts that commit the same action as they do. White kids are more likely to get slapped on the wrist or, oh, I'll call your mom, but like the black kid is sent to detention and they're suspended, and little black girls aren't given their same innocence. They're not allowed, they're fresh and they're grown and they move and they're fast little girls. And really, it's hot outside, so they're wearing a tank top and shorts. And I think with the title of this conference, Slavery and Its Impact, I think it's important, and what students should be told, I think it's important when you're talking about race in classrooms, it's important to talk about white privilege. And it's something that white people, they get uncomfortable when they hear the term. They, specifically lower class or poorer white people, they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to acknowledge something like that, because I had a teacher in high school, it was a law class, and we were talking about the criminal justice system, and I brought up the point that about how black men and other men of color are more likely to be arrested, charged, and put in jail for the same crimes that white people commit because of the color of their skin. And I pointed out, I was like, yes, you, Mr. Dutil, you have white privilege too. And he screamed and shouted. He threatened to send me to the principal's office and have him talk to me because I dare say that he has privilege because of the color of his skin. And he said, how do I have white privilege? I have a 13-year-old car. And well, yes, okay, just because you have a 13-year-old car, you grew up poor. You may not have class privilege, but there are certain things that society and this culture in America grants you that someone that looks like me will not be granted solely because you do not have the same color skin as I do.
I just want to make a really quick point, and I'm just, again, learning so much just sitting on this panel. But again, I look at my positionality as a faculty member at a Research One institution, and there's a lot of loaded representation of what that means. And I sit in faculty meetings where teacher educators, so these are professors preparing teachers, say things like, well, I don't do social justice.
Excuse me?
I don't do urban education. How can you be in education and not be about righting society's wrongs and not do social justice? So the people who are preparing teachers to go into our school where the student population is 46% students of color, what does that look like in actuality? So I just wanted to say that at every level, there is work to be done.
I think a larger problem in not just the education system, but especially in university level education, when Black students don't go to HBCUs and they do go to a PWI, predominantly white institution, we are ignored, marginalized, we're not talked about. I'm a member of the residence life staff here on campus, and during summer training, we talked a lot about minority students in LGBT, through an LGBT lens, and we talked about we need to make sure that we don't discriminate these people. We need to make sure that these type of students are cared for and loved, and they know that they are heard and seen. And we had 3 separate, I guess, I forgot the word, excuse me, I'm blanking here, but we all sat in an auditorium, we talked about this 3 separate times on 3 separate days, but not once did we talk about students of color and how they may be affected here on campus, because the reality is that students of color, not just Black students, but students of color in general, are the minority here on campus, and we need to make sure that they are loved for and they are cared for and that they are not discriminated against, and we are not discriminated against, and we feel safe and comfortable in a place where we may spend 4 years and that we live here. And I feel like it's something that's especially not acknowledged in the K through 12 area. When white teachers are teaching Black students, I remember in middle school, a lot of the time, I didn't really go to recess and stuff like that. I sat in the classrooms during the time and I hung out with the teachers, and a lot of the teachers would say things to me like, why can't all the other students be like you? You're so well behaved, like you speak very well, you're such a good student, Jayla. And I was like, and at the time I was like, oh, the teachers like me. But then as I grew up and I look back and I was like, I'm treated as the model minority student. Why can't it was their way of being like, why can't all Black kids behave like you? And I was always told that I speak very well. And I was always, growing up, people would ask me, are you mixed? Like, are you part white? Because I spoke very well and I was very eloquent with my language. And at the time, I was like, what does that even mean? But then I realized that's something that's called a microaggression. And teachers need to be trained when teachers need to be trained to not use that type of language. They need to unlearn that type of thinking when it comes to stuff like that.
I wanted to return for a moment. Was anybody else going to say something? I wanted to return to for a moment to your point about in terms of this idea of folks not engaging, saying that they're not engaged in social justice work. And I know y'all have to leave. Some people have to leave for class right now because it's passing. But I don't necessarily have an answer to, at all. But I think it's a question that we can sort of sit out for us to think about, because just because we're inside of a classroom, right, it's not a bubble, so we're still existing in political spaces. So it's hard for me to wrap my head around this notion of I'm not doing critical social justice work, or I'm not doing social justice work, when we live in a moment like the events that are happening right now, right, relative to racial injustice. I'm thinking now on the top of these multiple killings of Black transgender women, for example. I mean, this is happening on a monthly, weekly basis, right?
Black transgender women have a life expectancy of 35 years old.
So I think I'm wondering, right, I'm just posing, like in those moments when we have those conversations with our professional colleagues, if we could sort of like, I don't know, I used to have a professor when I was in teacher education. He would always like open up the pocket of his jacket and like bust out an article about something. I'm like, maybe I should just have like an article in my hand, like, so when folks say like, I don't do that work, I'm like, well, did you read this article today about like this incendiary comment that was on Twitter, or this event, that this additional killing of a person of color, by in the prison industrial complex, or by police authorities, to remind folks that like that this is a part of what education is. I remember also focusing a lot on standardized assessments because that was the pressure that I had as a classroom teacher as well. And then taking a moment to sort of live in my community and to look around and see the experiences that were taking place and taking notice of the injustices, that's just complete hypocrisy, right, to not engage that work. So I guess I'm wondering how we as adult faculty can have these teachable moments for our colleagues.
Thank you so much. We have just a few minutes left. Would anyone like to say anything in closing?
On college campuses, there's a lot of, I think all faculty also need to be, there's a sort of retraining that seems to need to go on college campuses among faculty periodically. We sort of, I know sort of new faculty go through, an orientation, 4 or 5 days orientation where they're sort of, they're reminded of the students in their classrooms. But once, you sort of go into your teaching and you're doing what you're doing, and as long as you're not, if you're sort of following all the rules and reaching all the benchmarks, nobody's ever going to call you back in to retrain you or to sort of talk to you about how you should be teaching in your classroom. So I just wanted to also just talk about that. We hear a lot of, from students who have faculty that underscores that point, I think.
Thank you. I just want to thank each of you again for your wonderful insight, and thank you for the audience.